Welcome to the Who's Left podcast, a show about Indiana politics, history, and culture from the unapologetic perspective of the Hoosier left. My name is Scott Aaron Rogers, and I'm recording from Bloomington. After a side quest to speak with Christian nationalism expert Dr. Andrew Whitehead last week, I returned this week to Indiana's Democratic congressional candidates. If you remember this quirky fact from a few weeks ago, I reached out to all 9 Indiana Democratic congressional candidates after the primary, hoping to set up interviews. At this time, I've still heard back only from the even-numbered district candidates. I will continue to effort the oddballs, including the only 2 Hoosier incumbents in Congress. Anyway, after talking with 2nd District candidate Lori Camp several weeks ago and Derek Holder in the 4th District after that, this week I turned my attention to Erik Hurt in the Bloody 8th. Indiana's 8th Congressional District is located in southwest and west-central Indiana. It includes Clay, Crawford, Davies, Du Bois, Gibson, Greene, Knox, Martin, Orange, Owen, Park, Perry, Posey, Spencer, Sullivan, Vanderburgh, Vermilion, Vigo, and Warwick counties, as well as half of Fountain County. Having gained its nickname as a long-time important swing district, including a congressional election decided by a mere 4 votes in 1984, the city of Bloomington was cleaved from the district following reapportionment after the 2000 census, and the 8th has largely been a safe Republican seat since. The sprawling district, anchored in Evansville, is the largest in the state by land area, and also includes the cities of Terre Haute, Vincennes, Jasper, and Washington. This biography of Hurt from his campaign website. Quote, Erik Hurt was born in Evansville, Indiana in 1991 to a working-class family. His great-grandparents immigrated to America from Poland following World War II, seeking the American dream, and instilled in him a sense of justice as a young man. He saw his family work tirelessly to provide a good life for himself and his siblings, only to see that work go underappreciated time and again. This background encouraged Erik to become politically active at a young age, studying political science at the University of Evansville before eventually pursuing a degree in history from Indiana University. He and his wife of 8 years, Caitlin, moved to Orlando in 2017, but in 2020 decided to leave Florida, and after debating where to go next, they decided to return home to Evansville in order to give everything they had to making their home the best place it could be. This led Erik to jumping into local politics with both feet, and in 2024 running for the 8th District congressional seat. A passionate lover of the arts, Erik met his wife performing in a production of MASH at Evansville's Civic Theater and has written and directed multiple feature films in his spare time. He is an avid baseball fan, archer, and enjoys playing video games, board games, and D&D. He currently lives in Evansville with his wife and 3 cats and manages a movie theater. End quote. Back in May, after the primary, I was super excited to speak with Hurt because here is a guy running an unapologetically progressive campaign in a state where party leadership consistently puts its thumb on the scales to favor more conservative Democrats. He overcame such opposition in that primary. As I thought we might, Erik and I hit it off and had a spirited, nearly 2-hour discussion. There's so much good stuff here, I couldn't possibly edit it down to a single episode, so I'm going to break it in 2. Today, in part 1, Erik will introduce himself and will spend the hour focusing on economic matters, including healthcare and education. I intend to release part 2 on Thursday, where we'll pick up our discussion about higher ed, before moving on to immigration, abortion rights, and his far-right MAGA opponents' odd priorities. Finally, we talk strategy, turning out urban and youth voters, working with energetic new mayors in his district, and warning seniors of GOP plans for Social Security. Now, before we turn to that conversation, I want to remind you that Who's Left is a pro-democracy organizing project. I'm the guy with the microphone, but I want everybody within earshot to think of themselves as participants. What's going on in your part of the Hoosier state? Are there topics you'd like to see me cover? Folks I should reach out to? I want your input, feedback, and advice. Remember the 3 P's of organizing. People coming together to exercise power, which Dr. Martin Luther King defined as the ability to achieve purpose, a specific concrete goal. That's us. You and I and everybody we know doing whatever we can and then more to build a more just, equitable, and compassionate Indiana. That's why I invite the guests I do. When we speak with candidates and elected officials, we have a direct line to those who do or might exercise the legitimate power of government on our behalf. When we speak with activists, we have opportunities to join with them and or learn from their activism. When we speak with academics and experts, we broaden our knowledge base so we can better understand the larger forces at work. I'm excited to continue to bring you this amazing summer lineup with multiple congressional candidates and some big nationally renowned authors sprinkled in amongst Hoosiers working at the state and local level to help their neighbors. I'm constantly working to bring more and more elected officials, activists, organizers, authors, and experts into our community so we and our people, our extended networks, can more effectively come together to exercise our power for our purpose of building a better Indiana. Now, I currently work as an independent craftsman during the day and work on this project on evenings and weekends. There are so many more things I want to do here at Who's Left if I could do this work full time, but I need your help to get there. So if you can, help me out with a paid subscription at scottaaronrogers.substack.com. For $5 a month or $50 a year, you can help me push our state in a better direction, and maybe, if we reach critical mass, I can put down my tool belt and devote my full time to you, to this project, and to Indiana's future. So if you have the means, pause right now, go to scottaaronrogers.substack.com and subscribe at the paid level. And while the best way to help this project is a financial contribution, if you can't afford it at this time, you can still help. Subscribe at the free level over on Substack. Set your favorite podcast player to auto-download new episodes of the show. Rate and review the show on whatever podcast player or platform you use. This is a very important way to help new listeners find us. Follow me on social media at facebook.com/whosleft. That's HOOOS left. I'm also on Blue Sky at the same handle. On Instagram, Threads, and Twitter, I'm at ScottRog78. That is SCOTTROG78. And on Mastodon at ScottRog78 at Hoosier.social. Full video episodes of the pod are now available on YouTube with clips on TikTok. The handle on both of those is at Who's Left. Please subscribe on whichever platforms you use and use that comment function. Interact. The DMs are always open as well to discuss ideas for the project. But most importantly, please share our message. Forward the articles to friends, family, and colleagues. Don't just like, but share on social media. Invite others to this community of Indiana leftists. Nobody is coming to save us. We've got to do it ourselves. To those who have joined this community already, especially those paid subscribers, thank you so much. I truly am honored and humbled. And to everybody, thank you for listening. Thanks for watching. Here's part 1 of my interview with Indiana's 8th Congressional District Democratic candidate, Erik Hurt. Erik Hurt, welcome to the HoosLeft podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Hello, thank you for having me.
All right. I start every episode like this. Tell the people, who are you, where are you from, and in your particular case, what motivated you to run for Congress down there in Indiana's 8th District?
So I'm Erik Hurt. I am from Evansville, Indiana, born and raised here. I moved to Orlando in 2017 and then came back to Evansville in 2020. And when I came back, there was definitely a desire to jump into, political activity, feet first. After 4 years of Trump and the year of COVID, and it was important to me to come back home and to do what I could to kind of, I think, move Indiana in a better direction. So when it comes to the congressional race, I've always been very politically minded. My great grandparents, they came over from Poland after World War II. My great grandfather, he was in the Polish army. He was a prisoner of war throughout the war. And so when growing up and hearing stories from them, there was definitely a innate sense of the dangers of fascism and nationalism that I grew up with. I come from a working class background. My mom was a single mom. When I was younger, she worked retail. My grandma worked retail. There was, a period of time where there were 4 generations living under the same roof. And when she married my stepdad, he's worked in factories his whole life. And so I grew up seeing how hard they worked, how much effort they put in, just, how tired they were coming home, after, a 10-hour shift or a 12-hour shift on their feet all day. And I think especially in, the last, couple decades, the disrespect aimed at people in those kind of jobs in retail and food service and manufacturing has really gotten just disgusting, really. I think it's terrible to see how many people just devalue what these people are doing. And it comes off, it's like, oh, if you're working that kind of job, you don't deserve a living wage. Right? You don't deserve these benefits. You don't deserve to get vacation or to see your kids. If you wanted to do those things, you should have had a different job. And, fairies will, make everything and, do everything else. And so, I grew up in that context. And so I've always been very politically minded, and just, seeing kind of where Indiana has kind of gone in recent years towards the right in governor's races and, a lot of these congressional races, especially in the 8th, after they redrew the districts in 2010, this used to be a very competitive district, and then it was rigged, it was gerrymandered.
I do believe, didn't Evansville and me up here in Bloomington, we used to be in the same district. And it was
exactly.
Yeah.
And it was the bloody 8th, and then it was gerrymandered, and we've gone further and further to the Republican supermajority in the state house, and since 2012, outside of Indianapolis and up near Chicago,
their region,
I think out of aside from those 2 districts, the congressional Democrats are 0 for 42.
Wow.
Yeah, and so my idea to come into this race, beyond, my key values and what I want to do in Washington and what I want for Indiana and what I want for this country, I want to see how we can really fundamentally change how Hoosiers think about politics in Indiana. Very, because I think we've gotten to the point, and especially like with somebody like Micah Beckwith now
Oh my God.
on,
Steering.
yeah, exactly. And that's where we're at right now. And that scares me for Hoosiers, because once you get to that point, it only gets harder and harder to come back from.
Yeah.
And so I really want to dig in and find out how we can start moving the momentum in the other direction. How do we move that momentum back? How do we keep young, talented leftists in Indiana, in the red parts of Indiana, working towards making a difference in their communities, running for office? I think I have the number right. Out of the 70 Republican-held state house seats, I think 35 of them are going uncontested.
Is that current this cycle, or was that last cycle?
I think that's this cycle. I may be wrong. There may have been some spots filled since I last looked, but I know it's a lot. And so how do we get people involved? How do we get young people involved? How do we get them motivated? How do we get them, how do you fight apathy and disillusionment with the government, and jump in? Because, another problem we face, in Indiana, definitely in Southwest Indiana, is voter turnout.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is in your under 30 crowd. And so a lot of my focus is keeping people engaged, getting people organized, and hopefully getting people networked too. Because there are a lot of colleges in this district. We have in Evansville, there's USI and UE, not to mention Ivy Tech. You got Vincennes University, you got Rose-Hulman, you got ISU, there's Marion the Woods, and then just outside the district, there's, obviously IU. How do you get people who are progressive and want to make a change? How do you get them connected? How do you get them networked? Because if there's going to be a movement, and it's going to take a movement, to really move the needle, it has to come from young people. That, there's no successful, progressive movement that hasn't, had, been fundamentally created by people under 30. And so that is, a big reason why I jumped into the congressional race, is to do that work, to speak to those people who maybe other candidates aren't necessarily hitting, because it's hard. It's hard to one, justify, spending that money and that time for a voter block that historically doesn't turn out the same way that, people in their 50s and 60s do. If they're not, donating money, it's hard to justify to the other, members of the team, people in the, Democratic leadership. And, it's just difficult to, get into that space and, kind of insert yourself into that space, kind of coming in, hello, fellow kids, how you doing? That, and I get it. I'm 32, so, I'm even, I like to think of myself as young, but, I'm an old man to some of these people now. And so, it's definitely difficult, but, and there's definitely people doing it. And there's, a lot of people, in Terre Haute, you have Brandon Sackbut as the mayor. I mean, he's younger than I am, and so, there are definitely people doing that. And so, I thought, if I can do this on a, congressional district level and use that platform to get people involved, I think that's a huge win, not just for me, but for Democrats across the state. If we can get, people together and that movement going. Because I think if we're just thinking in terms, or if I'm just thinking in terms of getting myself elected, I don't think that's what this race needs right now.
Right.
I think we have to think about, are we getting, people in state house races, some close ones there. If I can get them some more votes, if I make it easier for whoever's running in 2026, and they can make it easier for who's running in 2028, we have to think about that long-term vision. And if we can do that, we can make some serious change, and we can really move the needle. And I know we'll talk about it more with like campaign finance stuff. But we have to think in kind of like, I think a lot about the quote from Moneyball, where it's like, if you try and play like the Yankees in here, we're going to lose to the Yankees out there.
Yeah.
and we're playing Moneyball in Indiana.
Hmm.
We have to think differently. We have to use the resources that we have in really creative ways. And so I really want to start dissecting how we're using our resources in races like this. How can we take what we have and make the most of it in really, meaningful and long-term ways? So, that's a very kind of long-winded answer to why I'm running, but I hope that sort of gets to the heart of it.
Yeah. So, well, tell us a little bit about your professional life. What do you do out there in the quote unquote real world, and how has that prepared you for a role in Congress potentially?
Yeah, so I run a movie theater in Evansville. I've been doing that for a number of years, and I'm a big movie buff, and it's a passion of mine. And Yeah, so my professional career has mostly been in essentially retail management. And so it's that same kind of leadership idea of how do you best utilize your resources, how do you best utilize your people, how do you work efficiently and properly to give people a good experience, and all of that sort of basic intrinsic knowledge that exists to make a company kind of work in the right direction, can translate. Now, ideally, we're working not towards profits in the government. We're working towards what's best for the most people.
Yeah.
And so, I have sort of a kind of, I guess differentiation between, the goals there. But, it also stays true to, the people who work for me. My motivations and goals for them is to make as best environment I can, to make sure that they're treated as well as I can treat them, to make sure that they have everything that they need and all the resources that they need to make their work life as good as they can make it, and to do the best in my ability to kind of make things better for them. And so there's just sort of those basic sort of traits that you can translate to any kind of work in terms of resource management, efficiency, and leadership, is what I've tried to, harness in my professional life, and what I hope to bring to the campaign, and what I hope to bring to Washington.
Yeah. You talked about the values you learned from your family a little bit at the top,
Mm-hmm.
especially hearing their stories, about growing up in extremely difficult times, right? What other, be it from your family or other friends or colleagues or just whoever you picked these things up from, what are your core values that you're going to take with you to Washington?
Yeah. So, I mean, like I said, I think the core value I have is that, I believe that everybody deserves a fair shake. And everybody deserves, an opportunity to thrive. And that, we need to make sure we're providing a space that allows people to, make the most of their opportunities. And, a lot of talk from the Republican side of things in terms of like individualism and, gosh, pulling yourself up from your own bootstraps and merit stuff. Meritocracy only works if people have the opportunity to really compete with each other. And if you create an environment where it's only people with money who can, have these opportunities, well, then it's not a meritocracy at all. And so, I think at the heart of things is that, just people deserve to live lives of comfort and dignity and respect, no matter what you're doing, no matter what you're, where you're coming from. I think that's important, and fostering a sense of community and connections. I don't consider myself an individualist. I consider myself a person who sees, a rising tide lifting all boats. I think that's something that's really important. And that's why we have communities and cities and government is that, working together, using our resources together, that's what makes us able to succeed. That's why we're, able to, have the things that we have and progress the way we progress, is because we worked together to do those things. It's not everybody fighting for themselves. If we were all just, constantly homesteading, if we all had to constantly worry about making our own food and making our own shelter and, doing all these things for ourselves, we'd be lost. We'd all be fighting over resources.
People hated it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why we created the systems we have, so, I think having a sense of, connectivity and it comes to a lot of things, when we talk about like walkable cities and public transportation and those kind of things, it's about community and creating, third spaces and investing in schools. All of that is about how do we better the community on the whole. Investing in those things, investing in public works, in public spaces, investing in, public programs, whether it's, parks or libraries or any of those things. It's all about just how can we make our collective experience living together a little bit better. And I think that's something that kind of gets lost when we talk about different policies or programs, because it gets tied into, okay, what's the cost? What's the money? How do we justify paying this? And the justification can sometimes be, it's nice. It's a nice thing to have. It's a thing that makes living better.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't we want that? Why wouldn't we want to have that? And so you can get caught up into, talking about, oh, well, tax money and this and that and, yada, yada, yada. But is it a good thing for the community? Is it a good thing to have? Yes. Sometimes it can just be as simple as that. And I think that gets lost a lot. People were, I think especially with libraries, it gets nitpicked a lot. And I used to work at a library before I worked at the movie theater. I worked at the Central Library here in Evansville, and I loved it.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved the library. I loved going there. And I have a big book collection, and I have a lot of movies. If I had to buy every single book I wanted to read or every single movie I wanted to watch, it'd be broke. But for a couple bucks in taxes, I can just share all of these books and all of these movies and all of these resources with other people. That's great. Sign me up. I love it.
It's not a radical concept. You could not sell the concept of a public library today.
No,
you can't run out of a room as a communist.
Libraries. Yeah, 100 years ago, there's no way you have a library today. There's no way. And there's a lot of things like that. I think, even I worry about public schools in that framework. If
there
wasn't all that
things,
yeah, and I mean, there's with Betsy DeVos and all that stuff, and it continues constantly about pulling money from public schools, the voucher program for private schools and charter schools, all of that is just kind of pulling away from public schools, and there's and it was very similar, I think, with the stigmatization of public transportation, where it became very much this thing. Oh, you ride the bus?
Yeah.
It became something. Oh, you don't want to do that. I think there's some of that coming with public schools. It's like, oh gosh, yeah, no, we need to send our kid to private schools. We don't want to send them to public schools. Oh gosh. And I think that's very purposeful stigmatization.
Oh yeah.
It's people are intentionally doing that to kind of to make money off of
you want to build a negative feedback loop, right? You defund the schools and you pull money out of the schools and give it to the private schools, and then by doing so, you make the public schools worse. And then you can point at them and say, man, look, these public schools are really falling down on the job. They really suck. We should pull more money out and give it to the private schools. And then, but you follow that to its logical conclusion, and there are no public schools left.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. And it's an attempt. It's an attempt to establish an oligarchy or an aristocracy or whatever you want to call it, where rich people can have schools and have whatever they want and, do whatever they want because they'll always be able to take care of themselves, whether it's healthcare, whether it's public education, even, gosh, I mean, whether it's abortion, because if you have enough money, you're always going to be able to go to somewhere where abortion is legal. but you're going to keep poor people, and working class people, under, an oppressive system.
Yeah, these Republican guys always find a way to get their mistress an abortion if they need to, right? How many do you think Trump's
Exactly.
paid for?
Yeah, I'd hate to speculate, but
I'm going to set the over-under at like 6.5.
I'm gonna definitely say non-zero, but I won't go past that. But no, I mean, and that's where a lot of that motivation comes, but it gets packaged in, this negative sort of perception where it's like, oh gosh, don't you want to send your people over here? Don't you want to do this? Don't you want to do that? That'll signify that you're not part of that riffraff, riding the bus. And you make those systems worse, like you said, and it becomes that negative feedback loop. And I think that's a lot of stuff when Republicans get in office, where they pull funding and pull money, and then they point at these things and they say they don't work. Well, yeah, you're not giving them the resources they need to work. If you give public schools the resources that they need, and you give teachers the money they need and the resources they need, you can provide so many opportunities because there's so much infrastructure already there. Beyond just a normal education, beyond just setting them up for college, getting them basic life skills, working on trades, other things like clubs and activities and, things like, there are great, nonprofits, like whether it's, the Boys and Girls Club, or here in Evansville, there's a great organization called Young and Established that does a lot of great work of, giving, kids a space to go that is, safe and has resources to, help them, learn, or just, they have games and events and, kind of creating those third spaces. We can do that in schools because the infrastructure is there. We have, in terms of like public transportation, the school bus system is, a marvel. Another thing, if that wasn't already a thing years ago, I'd hate to see, us try to get, school buses, for free today, But, there's so many of those things that are already existed. If we fund them properly, give them the resources, we can do so much good. And I think there's in Evansville, we have a school called the New Tech Institute, and they actually offer a lot of things there. And you can go and you can do, cooking classes, and you can do, different things in engineering, or different things with trade schools, and but getting those into rural communities and making sure that they're not being overlooked, and a lot of the 8th district is, rural. And we want to make sure that it's not just the cities who have those resources, but it's the rural communities as well, making sure that their schools have those opportunities, their schools have that funding, to make sure that they have the same opportunities that somebody in a bigger city is going to have. And so I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, it's what the thing that really bothers me about the rural schools is that they take so much of a beating with all this defunding.
Oh yeah.
I mean, sure, you've got the inner city schools or whatever, right? That Republicans obviously want to demonize. But
Absolutely.
these rural schools, it's not, efficient, right? There's efficiencies you can find in the market by consolidating schools, and it winds up hurting these kids and hurting these communities. And boy, it's hard to connect those dots, I imagine, because a lot of the folks in those communities are voting for the people who implement those very policies.
Yeah.
So we hit on it a little bit. We talked about an aristocracy, a plutocracy, the oligarchs, consolidating, taking all of the wealth for themselves. The place that shows up the most obviously is in the economy. That's also always the number one issue for voters. And I assume you're hearing people's complaints about the economy as you go out and canvass and talk to voters and stuff. Um, the top line numbers look great, right? That's all you hear. Unemployment's at a 50-year low. Inflation has largely subsided. Uh, Stock market's doing great. The metrics look good. So I guess a couple questions. Like, number one, like, people don't seem to be feeling that in their day-to-day lives. Like, what do you think's going on there? And along those lines, are these metrics measuring the right things?
Yeah, so there at the end, I think you nail it. Are they measuring the right things? A lot of those metrics are measuring, I think, how the economy in general is doing, and I think it is strong for the people it's working for.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, our economy is structured to where it works for executives and administrators and the people at the top.
Yeah.
And so it's the whole idea that if it was trickling down, we'd be doing
You
great.
think it would have got
All
here
the
by now?
money is there. What'd you say?
You think it would have got here by now? It's been 40, 50 years.
It's been a minute. You'd think it would have started trickling down. It's almost like it was a scam. But no, so yes, so it's there. The money's there. It's just, and that's what it's kind of measuring, is that, yeah, no, it's, money's getting put in, those businesses, are seeing those returns, CEOs are making more money than they've ever made. Stock buybacks are going great for these people. And yeah, it's not, people aren't feeling it because it's not coming down to them. And you can have, as little unemployment as you want, but if the money isn't,
if you get there by making everybody work 2 and 3 jobs.
Yeah, exactly. if the money's if they're not making enough money to, provide for themselves, yeah, you can work all you want, and people are, there's so much BS conversation about people not wanting to work. People are working incredibly hard. There are so many reports that show we are as productive as we have ever been as a society, and that, our rates of production have gone up so much. People are working. What they're upset about is that they're not seeing a return for that production. And that's what's happening. And so, yeah, unemployment's low because, people are working their butts off. They have to, and they're just not seeing those returns. And it's designed that way. It's structured that way. It's intentional. And so, yeah, I think that it's important to use those metrics to understand, and there are other metrics that we can see in terms of real wages, the value of the dollar that people are making, when you compare it to the cost of rent, the cost of utilities, the cost of, food, those are metrics that we really need to be putting at the forefront as well. It can't just be what's the Dow doing, what's the NASDAQ doing, how much is the average person making versus what does it cost to live. That's the most important thing that you can look at. And right now, it continues to be where somebody making minimum wage in pretty much no part of the country can afford the average rent of an apartment. And that's what's important. And it's true about, I think, schools too. If somebody has a minimum wage job and they're going to school full time and they're working 20 hours a week, you're not going to make enough money working all year long to pay your tuition at IU, at Purdue, at any of these places. It's just not happening. And so, yeah, you're filling that job, you're working, it's taking care of that unemployment number, but are you getting enough back? And that's what we really need to look at. I think if we're not looking at those numbers, we're not looking at the right stuff.
The way I like to put it is that those top line numbers are a measure of how efficiently the economy is exploiting people. And, and if the numbers are looking great, that's usually not good for for all of us, I mean, those top line numbers look fabulous in like the 1920s, if I recall. How about
Yeah. Well, no, I think, a line I heard, and I wish I remember who said it, but unemployment, on plantations before the Civil War was 0%. So if that's the metric we're using, it's not necessarily you know showing what how people are doing in their real life.
Yeah, and so I think the takeaway from this is that the Biden campaign and some of the like the high level Democrats had to get just go Bidenomics, man. We're touting it. We're going out there. Look at those numbers. They're doing great. What I mean, not for a lot of people. They're not.
And I think mean there's definitely efforts, and you can obviously have to point to some of those victories. But yeah, I mean, there's deeper things to get into, and something I've thought a lot about, recently, like when was Occupy Wall Street?
That was 2008, 9.
I mean, it's been a minute. The fight for 15. 15's not even. That was a number. Yeah, 15 years ago, the fight for 15, and the minimum wage is still $7.25.
Yep.
And I think, there are those numbers, and I mean, it's good. It's good that those numbers are doing well, but that's not the whole story. That's not enough. We still have to dig in to those deeper numbers, those deeper issues, how it's affecting, 90% of Americans, people who don't have, big stock portfolios and, are living paycheck to paycheck, so they can't invest, in this great stock market. If we're not looking at them, we're not seeing the whole picture. We have to look at the whole picture.
Yes. And, well, part of that whole economic picture is healthcare, because, we're the only place in the, among the rich countries, I guess, as it were, that
on our peer nations.
Yeah, there you go. That's a much better way to put it. But we're the only one that doesn't have some form of universal health care, and so it falls on families. What would Erik Hurt's ideal American healthcare system look like?
And I mean, and so kind of going back to sort of my upbringing, there was a period where we didn't have healthcare. My stepdad worked at Whirlpool here in Evansville when that plant shut down and moved. So for a long period of time, and this was before the Affordable Care Act, and so we didn't have it. I got my teeth cleaned at USI because luckily, the students needed somebody to clean, somebody's teeth to clean.
Talk about
just not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I was, my mom made sure that we were taken care of. But yeah. And so for me, it's single payer. It's, I think a lot of that, sort of legwork has been done by people like Bernie Sanders, who, have set out what a single payer healthcare system looks like in the United States. And I think something, resembling what you see in most European countries can work in the United States.
Except for the NAS, you can't use them as an example anymore. Going our way.
Which is unfortunate, because I had a friend who was living in England for a while, and he had some medical things come up, and not as a citizen, he was able to go into a place and there's a menu board, MRI, CAT scan, just these different things. 45 pounds.
Let me get a CAT scan, a couple of and a large dialysis.
Yeah, ringing up at the cash register. But that's how it was. There was no, oh, we're going to get the bill in a month and we'll see what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Just, this is what you're paying. This is what you can get. This is what you'll pay. We'll do it right now. And he just gave him the debit card, and that was it. And people kind of, try and compare, oh, well, the wait times are going to be crazy, or, this, that, and the other. The resources and the money we have in America, we have the ability to outclass all of these.
Times are bad now.
Yeah, like
Try to get a primary care holder. Yeah.
No, comparatively, yeah. If you're saying that our wait times are the best in the world, they're not. I mean, there's a reason that other countries are living longer than we do. And I mean, that's, at the end of the day, that's got to be the argument. You can say it's like, oh, well, I guess in Canada, it's got to be so much worse. Well, they're living 5 or 6 years longer than us on average.
Well, it doesn't help we keep shooting each other.
Well, that doesn't help either. But I think an important thing to look at on that front too is that in America, the sort of economic divide between life expectancy is getting bigger. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. But getting back to kind of what I was saying, there's no reason that our healthcare system under a single payer system couldn't be better than any of these other countries. We have the resources, we have the people, we have the hospital infrastructure, we have the money. There's no reason why we can't be even better with a single payer healthcare system. And when you look at the numbers that have been put forward, and a lot of it gets tied up in semantics when you talk about money with healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because, oh, well, the taxes are going to go up. And as soon as people hear that,
Yep.
It's, game over. But the actual amount people will be spending goes down. You're just spending it in a different way. And so when we talk about it in economic terms, you're just, instead of paying, these people, you're paying this person, and that's all it is. And that person just happens to be the government. But it's, one of those things, you're cutting out, the middlemen in terms of insurance companies who are making, millions of dollars off of, people being sick and dying. You're going to save money there. You're going to, be able to, and people talk about, choosing your own doctor, this and the other. You already can't do that. I can't go to Illinois and, see somebody and know, going to be covered in my job.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and there's all that kind of stuff. For most people in their jobs, you can choose to sign up with who your, company decided to get your health care through, or you can pay public, or private, and it's going to cost you a ton of money.
Yeah.
And so you're already not choosing your health. I think most people have a similar experience as I do. I didn't choose who my company chose for healthcare. That was a corporate decision, not mine.
Yeah.
You're going to have more control over it if it's, publicly owned than you would if it's completely private. I can't go to, a, Blue Cross Blue Shield and tell them who, I want in network and who I want not in network. I don't have any control over that. And so, there's a lot of things. And I think when it comes to healthcare, it's so many of those benefits outside of healthcare too, whether it's guaranteed paid vacation, guaranteed like parental leave. It's one of those things where the conversation around it has become kind of what I said at the beginning. These people don't deserve that.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you don't have a job, or if you don't have the right job, or if you're only part-time and you don't get, healthcare, if you're only working 20 hours or whatever, and you don't qualify, well, you don't deserve it.
Yeah. It's a moral.
And that's what, yeah, it's a moral failing. You didn't work hard enough. You don't adhere to the Protestant work ethic. And therefore, I'm not going to pay for your healthcare, even though it will make my life better.
See, in our lifetimes, if COVID wasn't an argument for universal health care, I don't know what is.
Yeah, no, it is baffling to me that we've come out of that not gung-ho on universal health care. And I think it's something that's interesting looking back at it. There was a period of time where we were close. I think it was when LBJ was president.
I mean, we got close super early. Like,
Oh yeah.
World War One. I mean, I want to say like the Wilson administration or one of those Republican administrations right after him in the 20s was talking about this.
Yeah, we were very ahead of the game. And that's a lot of stuff when it comes to these things. When you look back at labor history in the United States with so many of the unions, with so many things that were being, advanced in terms of, workers' rights and corporate regulations and, the stuff that came out of the New Deal, we were at the forefront. And, when, a lot of Europe was, under, fascist regimes, there was a period of time where, during that New Deal, we were standard bearers
Yeah.
in moving things forward for people. And we really kind of got lost along the way. And I think a lot of that comes from Cold War era propaganda. Is that when you're looking at a lot of the sort of anti-Soviet stuff, it became, oh, it's not the totalitarianism and the authoritarianism and all of those things that you need to be worried about. It's social programs, government programs, and workers' rights. Those are the boogeyman. Those became the boogeyman. And so under the Red Scare and McCarthyism, those kind of things, it became in America, we have to set ourselves up as individualists, as capitalists, and that's what we need to be about. And during that time, we still had those super high marginal tax rates. We still had a lot of really good, government programs under LBJ. You had the Great Society reforms. And so we were making that progress. And a lot of people were still being left out. If you look at something like the GI Bill,
absolutely,
where, people of color were, completely left out, while, white Americans were able to go to school and get houses and, start building generational wealth. That's a different conversation about, getting that reconciled. But, that progress was getting made. But once those people who were raised on it got old enough to vote, they bring in Ronald Reagan. And the marginal tax rate goes from 80% to 30%. And, it has fundamentally shifted America in a way we have not come back from in 40 years, to where we have seen all these other countries where we used to be ahead of in so many of these, areas, whether it was, worker benefits and, healthcare and all these things, to where, you can go to, countries in Europe or Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, 4-6 guaranteed weeks, paid vacation, or, however much time, paid parental leave, or even, 6 months of half paid parental leave, something. And we've decided it's like, if your boss doesn't think you deserve it, well, I guess you don't deserve it. That's what we've decided over here. Where I think the reason we don't have the things that those other countries have is because of that period of time where people were raised on believing that those things were a moral failing. I think kind of getting, reconciling that idea, there are obviously still people who, think Ronald Reagan, was, the best president we've ever had. And I don't think we've fully reconciled the detriments he really, contributed to this
still
country.
living in the tail end of the Reagan era, I think. And,
yeah, we very much are. And
at least we're at the end.
and I think we're coming off of that, and we're definitely seeing movement in a different direction. But at the same time, as we've kind of come off of that, the age of members of Congress keep going up, and the age of governors keep going up, and so it's still the same people from 40 years ago in the government, and they're just continuing to go up and up and up. And so that younger group of people who weren't raised under McCarthyism and the Red Scare, they're still not occupying those positions of authority where they can make those systemic changes, or at least not enough. I mean, we're starting to see it. We have I think a Gen Z congressman now.
Maxwell Frost down there in Florida.
Maxwell Frost, yeah. And so, but it's slow going. And if, if we don't act soon enough, if Trump gets elected, we may not get there. We may not be able to put those people in those positions. If Project 25 rolls off and those people aren't there to stop it, I think we have to take that threat really seriously. And you can argue about the necessity of the stance that the United States took during the Cold War, and that we had to do these things or else Europe would have gone under whatever, the Soviet Union or this, that, and the other. But I think we really have to reconcile the shift it created in the United States. We brought union membership way down. It brought support for these different programs. Not to mention just the effect it had on taxes.
Mm-hmm.
What I said about the sort of respect and value of people in working class positions, that is something that I think comes out of that era in the Reagan administration and the go-go 80s. It's like you have to be working that corporate ladder. You have to be moving up. And if you're not doing that, too bad, we're cutting you off. We're still living in the tail end of that era in a real way, and we're still feeling those effects. And I think it's gonna take a lot of work to really get people to remember that those essential workers during COVID, they're essential for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing moves without them. You're not gonna make anything. You're not gonna have anything. Nothing is gonna get done without those frontline people. They matter. Their work has value, and right now we have set up our system where they are not seeing a return for that value. We need to change that. And one of the, I think, most obvious indicators of that is when you look at the growth of, or the comparison of CEO pay to employee pay. And it's it used to be, well, the average CEO maybe made 10 times more than their average employee. Now it's like 2,000.
Yeah. I think it was, even like 30 to 60 times maybe in like the 60s and 70s. And then Reagan came and it just shot right up. It ballooned.
And it's that devaluation of labor, of just a good, honest day's work. And if we can change the thinking of that, if we can get back and just say, yeah, you know what, the guy flipping that burger, that's great. I don't have that burger if he doesn't make it.
Mm-hmm.
He deserves a living wage. Somebody pouring a cup of coffee, that's a good, nice thing. I like that. I'm glad it exists. Somebody has to do it. They deserve a living wage. I don't think that's a radical stance to take. And yet we've created an environment where for some people that's a controversial thing to say. That somebody working a job that you want to exist. I think, I like that there are coffee shops.
Mm-hmm.
I like that there are restaurants. If I want those things to exist, but I don't want the people working those jobs to make a living wage, that makes me a bad person.
Yeah, I think so.
I really do.
It's slaver mentality, like, I don't know, polished up a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And that, it can be referred to, as like wage slavery. If you're only ever making enough to come back to work the next day, you're just being kept in this cycle to never be able to get ahead. And if we don't make college affordable, then you're not going to be able to get ahead that way. If we don't make housing affordable, well, you're going to wind up in a situation where we, bring company towns back, and
they're trying to.
They're trying. And that's what, I'm scared of where we're headed, in terms of those things. And I think we really need to change the way people think about work and labor and bring back a real labor movement. Like we saw it, at the turn of the 20th century. What made when people think about the idea of, that great America, it was built off of a labor revolution
Yep.
that built the middle class, that built, those things. And when we had those, companies thriving and building, through the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, that's when we had really high marginal tax rates. That's when we had a lot of these programs. That's when we had high union membership. So that era was built off of respecting workers and workers respecting themselves and standing up for themselves and saying, hey, I deserve these things. I deserve my life to get better. I deserve the fruits of my labor. And if we can get back to that, we're going to make life a lot better for everybody in this country.
Yeah, I'll tell you, the thing that really gets my goat on that, I know you sort of mentioned it a little bit. We were talking about the age of Congress going up, right? And it's all those boomers who grew up with that, on that foundation that was set up by union membership and high marginal tax rates, and that idyllic America that they want to talk about and they want to go back to. That was built on organized labor and taxing the rich, and then those same people who got good educations, that they could afford by just working a part-time job. They grow up, they come into power, they dismantle the thing that put them where they are. They pulled up the ladder behind it.
They absolutely did, and and we're living in the effects of that. And something I talk about a lot, because I'm a big proponent, and I'm sure you're not surprised, of public transportation, of building high-speed rail and things like that. And the big question is, of course, how do you pay for it? How did we pay to build the highways? We taxed the rich. Do it again. We can build anything. How did we go to the moon?
We convinced people it was necessary for national defense. The highways.
We can convince people.
Yeah.
If we can convince people that a train system connecting Evansville to Indianapolis and Nashville and Louisville is for national defense, I will take that.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that is I think a threat to our national security is an undereducated population.
Absolutely.
We're misinformed, disinformed, and have a hard time thinking critically because it's not valued. A lot of this thing it goes to the state of education, which we did talk about. I want to talk about higher education just a little bit. This is another one of those places where family budgets are strained in our country, where the rest of the world is, what is you doing, baby? Student loans, it does exist elsewhere, but not like we have it. So the student loan forgiveness under President Biden has been a godsend for a ton of people, self-included.
Nice.
But good. That's a one-time fix. And you hear the right complain about it, that if we just keep doing this again and again, prices are going to keep going up, and then they're going to just going to do another one-time fix again in 50 years. They have a point. I mean, this is a systemic issue that needs solved, and just forgiving this generation of debt isn't going to prevent the next generation from going into college debt. So, what should we be doing there?
Yeah, no. So I think you nailed it too. The student loan forgiveness is absolutely necessary. And when you look at the actual numbers and the amount that people have paid just on interest on these loans, that justifies the forgiveness. The money's been paid, it's been paid. It's just, it's on this predatory interest that people are making money off of.
And it's not even the government getting it, right? It's always, they've pushed it off onto some middleman so they can get their cut.
Yes, absolutely. So it's that program, it's not like we're taking money away from anybody. That money's been paid many times over for the actual cost of the education. It's just it people get tied up into just paying compounding interest, and it just keeps building up. But like you said, every conversation about forgiving student loan debt has to be accompanied by bringing the cost of college down. If we're not doing that, like you said, it's just a one-time fix. It's just a Band-Aid on the problem. If we're not getting to the root of the problem, which is college is too expensive, we're not doing enough. And, there are a lot of things in place that give people a lot of opportunities, different grants, different, scholarships and things like that. I was a 21st Century Scholar here at Indiana. I think it's a great program.
Yeah.
And I was able to, I got a full ride to the University of Evansville. I had my, books and room and board paid for. I was very lucky. For some personal reasons, I had to leave. And as soon as I left, scholarship's gone.
Yeah.
And so for people in that circumstance, if they have something come up, if life takes them on a different path, if they're not able to just go from high school to college and be able to, do it in 4 years, they can be left without a lot of recourse. And, I was lucky enough to be able to afford going back to school when I was able to do that, and go to IU and finish up my education. But not everybody's going to be that lucky. And so a lot of the system is built around just, kids right after high school. And we're leaving out a lot of the population. It's tough for somebody who's, maybe 27 and wasn't able to get those scholarships to be able to just, go back into it. And so, I mean, if we're not creating opportunities for people to be able to do that easily, we're leaving a lot of people out. And so for me, I'm a proponent of free community college.
Mm-hmm.
I think that needs to be absolutely established. Same with universal pre-K. Universal community college should be obvious. It should just be an extension of the K through 12 funding. And then, just utilizing state resources to bring that cost of college down. Like we had before, there was more funding, there was more state funding put into public universities, and we need to go back to that. We need to think about, how we allocate our resources and how we allocate our money. And again, it kind of comes into what we were talking about with healthcare, where you're not spending any more money, it's just going in a different direction. It may require more money in taxes from, that top wealthy percent of people, but the overall spending is going to go down because you're going to bring that cost of college down. You're not going to have to worry about student loan, interest and things like that. If you bring that cost of college down to represent the minimum wage, and if you look at, what it was comparatively in like the 60s and 70s, the cost of IU for a year should be like $4,000.
Yeah.
And I think it's something like $10,000. And so, if we're thinking about it in those terms, that's what we need to do. We need to be investing in these public universities to bring that cost down. Private universities, they can do what they want to do. I'm not going to say that they can't, but a public university, a place like IU, a place like Purdue, someplace like USI here in Evansville, there's no reason it should cost that much money because people aren't making that much money. It does not reflect, a public university's cost should reflect what people are able to afford. And right now it is absolutely not doing that. I don't think that people should have to be, parents shouldn't have to be saving for 20 years in order to send their kid to school. I think we're letting the American populace down by not investing properly to bring that cost down. I think that the fact that USI costs any more than $2,000 to go to is ridiculous. And it's represents a complete prioritization of resources, where the money's there, whether it's in, the military budget or police budgets or wherever we're, throwing this money to. The money exists. We just have to prioritize it correctly. And education should be one of those top priorities, because you're never going to regret investing in people's public education, or investing in people's education. You're never going to regret having a educated, talented, skilled populace unless you want them exploited. Unless you want to exploit those people, that's the only reason to not want to invest in their education.
Once again, that was Erik Hurt, Democratic candidate to represent southwestern Indiana's 8th District in the next Congress. Come back later this week for part 2, where we will pick up our discussion about higher education before moving on to immigration, abortion rights, and his Trumpy opponent, Mark Mesmer. We'll also talk strategy, turning out the base, working with the dynamic new mayors in his district, and flipping pro-democracy Republicans. That will drop Thursday. Until then, thank you for listening, and thanks again to my guest, Erik Hurt. Find him at erikhurtforcongress.com. That's Eric with a K. Please help his candidacy however you can, with a contribution, by volunteering, by mobilizing everyone you know in southwestern Indiana. If you can afford to help both of us, I kindly ask you to consider a paid subscription at scottaaronrogers.substack.com. A membership over there is the best way to help HoosLeft keep growing. In addition to Substack, you can find me on Facebook, Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok at HoosLeft, and on most other social media sites at ScottRog78. If you want to send me a message, my DMs are open on social media, or email me at scottrog78@gmail.com. Forward the show to a friend, and have them forward it to another friend. Let's keep this project going. Until next time, this has been the HoosLeft Podcast. I'm Scott Aaron Rogers. Love each other, Indiana.